in the Midlands, Nick.
Hey, Michael. Thanks for having me on the show.
Oh, thank you so much for taking the time out to be with us.
Oh, sure. I'm happy to.
All right, great. If you would, let's start out. Maybe you could tell us a little more about your background, what got you started in all this, and maybe give us some reference in some of your books and where to get them.
All right, sure. Well, my intro, I'm one of these people who's into UFOs, who's never actually had a personal UFO experience. You know, a lot of people do get into the subject because they've seen something weird and they want to find out what it is. Mm-hmm. But in my case, my interest goes back to when I was a young teenager. My dad was in the British Royal Air Force and worked on radar, and he was involved in a number of incidents in the early 1950s where the radar guys tracked UFOs flying over the North Sea off the east coast of England. Mm-hmm. And the first thought was, well, it's got to be the Russians, launching a sneak attack. This was the height of the Cold War. And so aircraft were sent up, fighter planes from a nearby Air Force base to try and intercept what they thought were Russian bombers or something along those lines.
Sure.
And when they got up there, they actually reported seeing these weird balls of light in the sky that were performing fantastic maneuvers and speeds and hovering and zipping around behind the aircraft, to the point where eventually they all had to return to base, and because they were running low on fuel. This went on for several nights, and in the end everybody was taken into a room, that's the pilots, the radar people, ground crew, etc., and told, you won't talk about this. And my dad didn't talk about it till I was, like I said, about 13, and he told me then. And that sort of really got me interested in the subject in terms of reading about it, and not so much doing research at that age, but, buying books and subscribing to magazines and things. Mm-hmm. And then when I finished school, I began working on a rock music magazine back in England for a couple of years called Zero. And I still do mainstream journalism stuff now, but that was sort of what got me involved in journalism. And then I thought, after a few years of doing that, why not try and combine the background in journalism with the interest in weird stuff, whether
Right.
it's UFOs or Bigfoot or whatever, and combine the two. So that's what I did, and I've written for, as you pointed out in the introduction, for various magazines. I write quite regularly for UFO Magazine and Fate and 14 Times, and done about 20 books myself, and, as you said, also ghost writing for other authors on anything really, sort of pretty much related to weird stuff, I guess.
Yeah, that's it's a big interest nowadays. I mean, before people were interested years ago, but they're afraid to speak up about what they've seen. And now it's like people everywhere are coming out with this information. And, something I wanted to touch on is this FBI memo that came out about Roswell. Have you had a chance to see that?
Yeah, I have. I mean, it's interesting because, Roswell's one of these cases where it just never goes away. The interesting thing about Roswell, we know that there was sort of a heavy military involvement in whatever happened, but that's sort of confounded by the fact that we only have one or two pieces of official paperwork on the case, one being this FBI document which references the recovery of the object and then its transfer for analysis to another location. And after that, everything goes quiet. The government says, well, we've searched and we can't find any other paperwork. It's like it's just all vanished. But at least because there are one or two things that have surfaced, it's encouraging that maybe one day we might get other files possibly as well.
Yeah, as these files and more evidence keeps piling up, and I mean, you got millions of accounts of UFO sightings. I mean, I've said this a million times, I'll say it again, in a court of law, if, 100,000 people pointed me out as committing a crime, I'd be done, so... But yet, hundreds of thousands of people see UFOs, and it's just swept under the rug all the time.
Well, that's right, and I think the big problem is that, the reason the secrecy has been kept so well is I think the number of people actually in the know is probably very small. And I think because of that, the trying to find out who it is that's hiding the truth, that's what makes it difficult, because they're not in the wide open, they're buried very deeply, to the point where not only do we not know what to look for really, but we don't even know exactly where to go looking for it, which agencies sitting on the big secrets, which ones are sitting on, interesting data, but they don't have the hard evidence. A lot of people don't realize that the various government agencies don't necessarily just hide information from the public, but they actually don't always share information with each other. which makes it even harder to, to dig out the truth.
Sure, but they've done a good job of hiding the evidence, I would say, but I don't think they've done a good job of keeping the secret, because I think more people than not believe that we have been visited, and I happen to be one of them people, and I know you are too.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think, what the government has done is managed to hide the hard evidence, sort of, the nuts and bolts evidence, but they obviously haven't been able to hide the fact that people see UFOs, because, there's just no way to do that. If half a dozen people driving home one night see a UFO in the sky or say they've been abducted, well, government agencies, it's physically impossible to hide that sort of stuff. So I think people realize there's a genuine phenomenon. What the government, unfortunately, has been successful at doing is preventing us getting past just the testimony and to the hard data that would prove it.
See, now I get asked this question a lot. Do you think that, we're close to disclosure? And I always say that, disclosure's already happened. I think, enough people have come out and spoke about these things. I think the bigger question is will the government ever admit to it?
Yeah, that's right. I think, the big problem is, in whose mind have we solved it? I think if you look at the collective body of information we have, you can argue we have disclosure because, in a court of law, people have been convicted of murder when there's no body, So, in other words, if you can convict someone of murder without actually finding the body, then you should be able to prove the existence of UFOs by the collective body of material of evidence that's been put together and analysed from credible sources. So in that sense, we do have disclosure, but I think unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on which way you look at it, people still want, at the end of the day, demonstrable proof that these things exist. That's what I want as well. I believe there's a genuine phenomenon, there's no doubt in my mind about that. But, I'd still like to see the body in, frozen storage or whatever at some, military base, just to be able to say with certainty that, yes, this all exists.
Oh, exactly. Me too. Now, I don't know about you, but I've had UFO sightings, and I can't say who was driving them or if anybody was up there driving them. I know that what I seen was nothing I've ever seen in an airport before. So, I think for me, it's pretty much proven in my mind. But yeah, I would like to see a body too. Even more so, I'd like to see one alive.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I think we'd all like that. But, sort of joking aside, I think the only way we really will, we just have to keep pushing and pushing for more information and just, really trying to get the hard evidence, etc., of what's going on and, what this all means and what the implications are for us. And when we get to that point, we can then go to the next step. Right now, we're at the point where, we know there's a tremendous body of material, evidence, etc. It's how we get past that to, the next level then, I think.
Right. And, I was talking about contactees in the beginning of the show, saying that, that was something we would touch on. And,
yeah.
There have been many contactees who have actually been put the lie detector test and have passed. I mean, take Travis Walton's case, for instance. All them guys took lie detector tests and they passed.
Oh, yeah. There's, when a lot of people assume quite wrongly that if you see a UFO, you're either crazy or drunk.
Oh, yeah.
Or both. But, a lot of people, you rightly point out, have taken lie detector tests. We have very credible reports from military pilots, airline pilots, radar operators, police officers, people whose testimony under other circumstances would be just fully accepted. But it's kind of like when you deal with UFOs, no matter who the person is, oh, well, that just can't be true, It's
and
that's what we're facing, unfortunately.
I can't believe the excuses that they come up with mass sightings, such as the Arizona Lights. They tried to say that was flares, and Roswell, it was a weather balloon. But first they said it was a UFO that crashed, and I'm thinking, don't the military know the difference between a weather balloon and, a craft?
Well, yeah, that's one of the important things about Roswell. A lot of people don't realize is the government's actually changed its story now on like 4 occasions. You're quite right. Initially, they did say we've recovered a flying saucer.
Mm-hmm.
24 hours later, they said, sorry, it's a mistake, it was a weather balloon. Then in 1994, after pressure was put on them by a U.S. Congressman, Stephen Schiff, the representative for New Mexico. They said, well, okay, it wasn't a weather balloon; it was something called a mogul balloon, which is designed to monitor for early Soviet nuclear weapons tests in the 40s. And then somebody said, well, what about the bodies? And they said, well, these were just sort of monitoring balloons. There were no people on board, so the stories about bodies were all false. And they said that in 1994. Then in 1997, they changed the story again and said there were bodies after all, but they were crash test dummies used in high-altitude parachute experiments. So in one respect, it's almost like, people think this sounds crazy, but it's almost like the government wants us to realize that they're actually not telling the truth, because by changing the story so many times, it raises suspicions rather than, does the exact opposite.
Exactly, and I was going to bring that up, that, they come back and said that those were crash dummies, and it's just amazing, and that's what I mean. You would think that they'd come up with better stuff than that, and certainly, if you or I were being interrogated and we changed our story 4 times, we'd be stamped liars and probably put in jail.
Yeah, well, that actually makes me wonder sometimes if there are people in government who want the secret out, and they deliberately have gone out their way to make the cover-ups scenarios look stupid and ridiculous, to kind of get like a silent message out to us that, we shouldn't believe all we hear, So.
Mm-hmm. Now, have you yourself ever had UFO sightings?
No, I haven't. As I said, it was my dad's experience that got me involved. But, I've done a lot of interviews with people and spent a lot of time in government archives going through old files. And it's sort of this collective body of evidence, the people, the documents, the testimony, film footage, etc., that convinces me there is a real phenomenon. And, yeah, I'd like to see something, but I don't feel that, if I don't, that it has any lesser bearing on, the idea that this is real.
Now, many think that governments, especially the United States, is going to try to stage some false flag where it looks like UFOs are attacking us of something along them lines. What do you think about that?
Well, that's an interesting scenario. It's been put forward by various researchers, the idea that, the sort of manufactured threat, if you like, to sort of take away people's freedoms, etc. And whether it would, I've heard these rumours, whether it would happen or not, is a different thing. But the fact is, it would probably work.
Yeah,
that's the scary thing. It's that when people feel threatened, they turn to government and they'll pretty much give up whatever rights they have to be protected, whether it's a real threat or a manufactured one. So
I have to take a break here. It's a short one, so just hang on with me, and I want to come back and comment on that. So just hold on a minute. I'm Michael Vera. This is Late Night in the Midlands. Nick Redfern is my guest, and you're more than welcome to call in soon at that's 803-748-9293. We'll be back in just a few moments. Nick, we're back, and so we were just talking about government staging UFO attacks. I believe. So, for me, if I seen that, I would. It'd have to be pretty real. Buildings would have to be blowing up for me to even consider it, because if they wanted us, they could have done this already.
Yeah, I think, it's a theory that you see discussed in sort of various conspiracy circles, etc. To what extent it has actual validity in terms of somebody doing it, or planning it, that's a different thing. I think, it's one of these areas where it's an interesting and a disturbing theory, but I think, we need to sort of tread carefully and realize right now that is all it is. And, if it can be taken further, then it needs to be exposed, so we need to sort of, keep looking to see where it leads, if you like.
Sure. I think I'd be more afraid of what our own government can do rather than what some alien government's going to do.
Yeah. Well, my view is, if although the UFO phenomenon kind of doesn't sort of do the literal sort of landing on the White House lawn type thing, the fact is it doesn't, it never has sort of attacked us, if you like. And there's never been, some sort of massive invasion. And I would have thought if that would have taken place, the ideal time to have done it would have been when we didn't have things like nuclear weapons and aircraft and spacecraft, when we could stand a chance of defending ourselves. So whatever the nature of the phenomenon is, I don't think outright hostility seems to be part of its agenda, at least not now. So.
Right, and I've heard plenty of stories, and even guests who have been on here who have talked about these UFOs shutting down nuclear power plants temporarily and disarming weapons.
Yeah, there's a lot of stories like that. Nuclear silos where all the power, not so much the power's gone out, but the launch codes on the missiles have been scrambled by, when UFOs have been overhead, almost as if they're just sort of demonstrating the power that they do have if they ever needed to use it. If we ever kind of got to that point of being close to war, they may have the ability to actually prevent sort of the ultimate war from taking place.
And something else that should stand very credible are some of these U.S. Air Force pilots or even other countries, their Air Force, who have reported seeing these things. I mean, here's people who are trained to identify what they're seeing in the skies, and they come forward and talk about these things, and all of a sudden they're labeled kooky.
Yeah, I mean, that's the ironic thing. People, like, for example, airline pilots, you go on your holidays in a 747 or whatever, and you trust the pilot to be an expert flyer and know everything that's going on. But then suddenly if they see a UFO, people question them. And yet, you would accept their testimony on anything else. If they said they saw a weather balloon pass by the plane or a near miss with another aircraft, people accept that. So why is it they don't accept it when they see a UFO? It says more, I think, about people's belief systems and prejudices than it does the realization that this is a very credible witness. So, I think it's kind of like one rule in one situation and one in another almost.
Right. I think some people who won't even acknowledge that these could exist, I think that they're, maybe some of them, their religious beliefs are threatened by this or whatever it may be.
Oh, yeah, I would fully agree with you on that. I think a lot of it does purely and simply come down to belief systems and ideas of what's going on in the world, and they don't like those sort of their firm belief system they were brought up with. They don't like those challenged, and the UFO subject has the ability to challenge a lot of belief systems.
Absolutely. Now, how different does the British government handle UFO reports compared to, say, the United States or Canada? Or
I would actually say it's surprisingly similar because we have, like most of the reports in nearly all countries, most countries at some point have investigated UFOs in varying degrees. Mm-hmm. And most reports, even in the government files, can be explained in rational terms, but there's always this small percentage that fall into a different category that, where you have reports from highly credible witnesses. You have cases where there's perhaps interference to vehicle, car engines and things like this, or electrical systems. And we see a similar thing going on in Britain that we do in America, where there's like a public office where the government says, okay, we have investigated UFOs and this is the office, but this is all the information they have. But then we hear rumours of deeper, more secret investigations in Britain in the same way that we do over here in the US. So in other words, it's a very similar situation, and I'd actually be surprised if all these different countries that are friends with each other developed their research procedures separately. I think there are certain countries who are briefed on the truth, and they handle it in the same way. They know they can't hide it, so they have like this front window image of a little group that has a few interesting reports, but they're not hiding any big secret. And then the real deeper work goes on behind the scenes outside of the public and the media scrutiny. And that's something we see in Britain, and, these rumours and stories of classified research, having far more knowledge than the public offices do.
Sure, and one difference I noticed, like in the United States, when our media covers something like a UFO, they always end it with a joke and a laugh. And you look at news from, say, China, and they take it very seriously, and I'm surprised they even let that kind of reporting go on, but they do. Yeah, because when the UFOs were spotted over their airports and shutting their airports down, I mean, I seen Chinese newscast on that. And here
I think a lot of countries, it really depends on the country, and sometimes, you're right, it is quite surprising which ones are more open to it and which ones aren't. I think, unfortunately, sometimes the media, even the journalists themselves who are covering the stories, they get swayed because clear. I know this as a fact. Some journalists won't touch the subject unless they can poke fun at it because they're fearful of their reputation becoming like the journalist who chases little green men, and they're worried it'll kind of affect their ability to get a Pulitzer Prize or whatever.
Well, I've been asked before, do I believe in little green men? And I say no, little gray ones.
Exactly. So, yeah, I think a lot of it comes down to even the opinion of the journalists. Journalists are supposed to be impartial and just follow a news story, but they always seem to have this sort of psychological need to make a little joke. But they would make a joke about another regular story. It's just, I think a lot of it is their insecurities about being perceived as believing in the phenomenon. In my view, they should have a few more guts and stand up and say, hey, this is an interesting, credible story, and leave it at that.
And that's what the media is supposed to do. They're supposed to give us the truth and bring us the truth. So, and they don't. So it's good that there's, alternative media shows out there that will. I mean, I don't care. I mean, if somebody ridicules me, so be it. No, that's
exactly the way I look at it as well. So, you've got to have tougher skin. So.
Absolutely. Can you tell everybody about some of your books and where they can get them if they should choose to get them? You've got a lot out there.
Yeah, I've done quite a few books. I've done everything from UFOs to Bigfoot, the Loch Ness Monster, the Chupacabra, strange creatures, all sorts of Men in Black, all sorts of things, contactees.
And I would like to get into some of that stuff as we go on.
Sure. Mm-hmm. All right. And people can find out more about the books at nickredfernsbooks.blogspot.com. And they're all available from all the usual outlets like Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Borders, etc.
Oh, okay, great. Yeah, I've been on your website periodically checking things out, and you've done some great work. You really have.
Okay.
And I've heard you on Coast to Coast AM before as well. So, yeah.
All right, well, cool, thanks.
Oh, absolutely. Now, how much truth is there to, I'm going to skip off of this just for a moment, but, after the break, I'd like to get into the Men in Black just a little bit. But Bigfoot, how much truth is there to Bigfoot? I mean, that's another case where we hear about sightings, but there's never no proof. I mean, I've sometimes thought maybe linking them with UFOs, the way they disappear.
Well, actually, that's one of the areas that I do a lot of research in, is sort of the stranger side of Bigfoot. Now, a lot of people, let me just backtrack first. The study of things like Bigfoot or the Loch Ness Monster is known as cryptozoology. Mm-hmm. In essence, the study of animals that regular zoology doesn't recognize as existing and regular science doesn't recognize as existing. But you're quite right. One of the things that sort of typifies many of these creatures is that they're elusive. And they're not just elusive, it's almost like they're too elusive. Mm-hmm. They're almost kind of like phantoms that flit in and out of existence. One minute they're here, and next they're gone. They never sort of leave tangible evidence of their existence. Now, most mainstream cryptozoologists consider that Bigfoot, like the abominable snowman of the Himalayas, and the Chinese equivalent, which is called the Yeren, and the Australians have their own version called the Yowie. Mm-hmm. The conclusions are that they're just a type of unclassified ape, a type of ape that science hasn't found yet. And so because they haven't found it, they don't believe it exists. Now, I said mainstream and conventional cryptozoologists believe that, but I don't sort of consider me to be sort of mainstream or conventional. And my personal view is that I actually do think there is a great deal of evidence that points down the path that Bigfoot is some sort of paranormal creature. Now, the paranormal is sort of a term that gets sort of bandied and thrown around in ways where, it can mean anything from chain-rattling ghosts to ESP or whatever.
Sure.
But I think with Bigfoot, I think there's something for the idea that Bigfoot could be like an extra-dimensional creature. For example, quantum physics today is allowing for the existence of multi-dimensions beyond the three that we exist in. And indeed, the easiest and simplest analogy is kind of like you're driving your car and you turn the radio on, you don't like the song you hear, so you tune your radio to another channel. The idea is that dimensionally, you could jump from dimension to dimension in the same way you jump from radio channel to radio channel. And possibly, I think there's something to this, that Bigfoot can flit in and out of our existence, and that's why it seems so elusive, almost to the point of being like a phantom that it actually doesn't exist in our reality most of the time. I think I do believe it's some sort of like a paranormal entity, depending on how you term the paranormal.
I would agree with that totally. I mean, because again, here somebody will see one of these creatures, and and I don't even know. I would think it has some intelligence, obviously, because it's able to not be found. But it heads into the woods and it's gone, and we can never catch these things. So,
well, you actually bring up a good point there when you talk about its intelligence. I think it's often very much our personal prejudices and arrogance and egos as human beings to think if something looks like a dumb hairy animal, that it's a dumb hairy animal.
Right.
I actually believe that these entities, the Bigfoot entities, are highly mentally developed. Now, obviously, they're not sort of driving cars and building atomic bombs, which actually is probably in their favor not to go around building atomic bombs. But I do believe that they possibly are spiritual, and when I say spiritual, I mean like a highly evolved mental state.
Sure.
And possibly even possessing pretty extraordinary mental capabilities that, again, that's another reason why they remain so elusive. It's almost we go looking for them in the woods, and immediately they know. It's like we go from being the hunter to the hunted, if you like.
Yeah, I seen a movie once, and I can't remember what it was called or what have you, but there was like a Bigfoot kind of creature, and when people would get close, you just blend right into the brush. I mean, just kind of almost like shapeshift.
Yeah, sure. I mean, this is. I mean, people talk about that. For example, people have found, for example, footprints in the snow, and they suddenly come to a halt in the middle of the nowhere, as if the animal is literally, just vanished.
Right.
I mean, I do mean literally vanished. And if we only had one or two reports like that, that would be one thing. We actually don't. We have dozens of reports like that. But many sort of mainstream cryptozoologists write them off by saying, oh, well, the snow must have melted, etc., around the prints. But, that's just not viable when it occurs on so many occasions. And there are even reports of Bigfoot kind of vanishing in a flash of light and things like that. And this sort of scenario isn't just applicable to Bigfoot. It's, applicable to things like the chupacabra and other unknown animals where, I think there's something, as I said about them, that they're not just elusive, but they're beyond elusive even.
Yeah, tell me a little bit about the chupacabra. I've really never discussed that a whole lot, and I know that you've studied it, so yeah.
Yeah, I've been on a number of expeditions now to Puerto Rico looking for the chupacabra. Basically, the story, although there have been reports of sort of weird creatures that over the years have become known as devil bears and the chupacabra and all sorts of different terminologies being used to describe the fact that all across Puerto Rico for years, for decades, animals have been found under very weird circumstances, drained of blood, and with puncture wounds literally to the jugular vein on the neck, which has given sort of rise to these theories that it's some sort of vampire-type creature. But the term chupacabra has actually only been around less than 20 years now on the island of Puerto Rico itself, and I've been there on a number of occasions looking for the chupacabra, and it's described by most of the eyewitnesses as having sort of a chimpanzee-sized body, and also in kind of its bulk, sort of kind of like a chimpanzee, sort of like a slim, muscular creature, but with large, bright eyes, very vicious-looking fangs and claws, and what looks like a row of spikes down its head and the back of its neck, which kind of has sort of given rise to it kind of looks like a punk rock mohawk type haircut almost. And a number of witnesses have said it has these large bat-like wings. So rather than feathery wings like a bird, they're almost like membrane-type wings that a bat has. And I've spoken to a lot of farmers, police officers, veterinarians, civil defense workers, members of the public who've seen the creature and describe it like this way. And also ranchers who've talked about waking up in the morning and finding their farm animals dead and literally drained of blood. The term chupacabra is actually a Latin term meaning goat sucker, because most of the animals that were initially killed and found dead were goats, which are easy prey. They're small animals. They're not able to pretty much defend themselves. So
Sure.
That's why they were, I think, attacked. And so that name stuck. And when you speak to people on the record and stand before them, you learn over time to become a good judge of character. And I've always come away suitably impressed by the eyewitness testimony. Now, on each occasion I've been there, I've heard various theories as to what the chupacabra is. One is that it's sort of a definitive alien creature. Another one is that it's an animal that science just hasn't found yet, a regular but strange animal from the Earth. A third theory is that it's sort of the result of some weird genetic experiments, like a military experiment. And then the fourth one is that it's quite literally something that's been sort of conjured up by one or more of the many occult groups which actually do exist on Puerto Rico. There's a lot of sort of occult worship type groups on the island of various persuasions. My personal view on all the theories is that I don't think it's as simplistic as saying it's a pet of the aliens or something like that.
No.
But I do think there's something to the idea that it could be an indigenous unknown animal. And there are also paranormal overtones. So, I actually do believe, in the realm of the occult. I do think it could be something supernatural. The one I do kind of rule out, though, as well, is the genetic mutation. I think, government agencies are up to a lot of things. But if you ask me, do I think, do I think like they could transform or mutate like a little cuddly rhesus monkey into like a 5-foot-tall flesh-eating killing machine with wings? Well, I don't think they can quite do that just yet. But I'm willing to be proven wrong. So
you know what? I kind of think that they can because
maybe they can.
Well, I want to tell you quickly about Plum Island. I'm sure you've heard of Plum Island.
Uh-huh.
Oh yeah. Now there was creatures that washed up ashore there, and it was nothing anybody's ever seen before. They looked really strange.
Well, yeah, I mean, in fairness, I don't live on Puerto Rico. When I've gone, I'm only a visitor, and you have to respect the views of the people there. And I have heard that theory a lot of times. That a lot of people do believe that the military's been doing, or the government scientists have been doing a lot of weird experiments with gene splicing and
trying to
make
like a super soldier of some kind.
Yeah, like genetic manipulation. Now, if you go back 50 years, the only way to successfully crossbreed any sort of animal, and most of the time it would fail anyway, is literal sort of artificial insemination, with eggs and sperm, etc.
Sure.
Gene splicing today, though, is very different. It's like where you literally splice the DNA of different species at a genetic level, and you reconfigure and combine them, and that's why there's so much concern about this, because essentially what you're doing, you're creating new life forms, not really knowing what the end result's going to be, and for that reason we should have major concerns about this. It's not something to take lightly. If you can one day have the ability to cross, to gene splice a gorilla and a human being.
Absolutely.
It would be pretty horrific if you have, something with sort of the body of a human and the mind of a gorilla, or vice versa, or the body, a hairless body, but, the look and build of an ape, or just something that was such a genetic freak that, just insanity, it bred insanity through their entire, their mind, so to speak, which can happen, when animals are crossbred. They often show evidence of physical and mental abnormalities, and, who knows, I'll be the first to admit, we don't really know what's going on in some of these unchecked labs, where they're getting under the table funding just to research weird areas, if you like.
Sure, but that being said, I still agree with what you were saying, too. I think there's plenty of species that we haven't discovered yet on this planet. I mean, we spend so much money trying to kill each other, and we don't put enough money into researching our own planet.
No, you're right. I mean, a lot of people don't realize that the giant panda, which everybody takes for granted now, this sort of big, looks like a bear, but actually, they're a panda with the sort of black and white and the big sort of panda eyes. One of these was never actually seen in the Western world physically in flesh and blood until 1924. And even the Congo gorilla, they were actually, even at rumor level, sort of in the 1700s. They were seen as a myth or a legend. They weren't actually proven to definitively exist as gorillas as we know them today. So in other words, if creatures like that can have only been found in the last couple of centuries, it's not out of the question at all that there could be other animals, large animals out there, hiding stealthily in the jungles and the rainforests and deep under the oceans, that we just have not found yet.
I agree with you. Well, listen, Nick, we have to take a break here. This one's a little longer. You got about 10 minutes, so I'm just going to put you on hold and just hang on there, and we'll be back for our last hour.
Okay, cool.
All right, great. I'm Michael Vera. This is Late Night in the Midlands. Nick Redfern is my guest. In this next hour, I will take your calls if you want to call in at 803-748-9293, or you can call in on Skype. Just Skype to Skype, Late Night in the Midlands. If you're going to call in on Skype, wait till we come back. Hey, Nick, about these men in black. What kind of reports have you seen about the men in black?
Yeah, I mean, this is a sort of a weird area. I mean, you just sort of, you played the Will Smith song down from the Men in Black film, and a lot of people think, the whole Men in Black thing is just like an entertaining Hollywood film.
And
a lot of people don't realize that the film itself was actually based upon existing reports of the Men in Black.
Mm-hmm.
Now, when you look at the real reports, they seem to fall into two categories. You do have the one group that does sound, that does sound like the characters portrayed by Will Smith and Tommy Lee Jones in the films, sort of like secret government personnel investigating UFOs and trying to silence witnesses and, warning them not to talk about UFO experiences. But then on the other hand, we have weirder Men in Black as well that some people actually believe are aliens themselves, as controversial as it sounds. They kind of look weird. They look very thin and pale. They have these pull-down hats and dark sunglasses as if they actually look slightly different to us, but they're trying to disguise the way they really look with these wraparound shades and hats and turned-up collars, etc. So in other words, there seems to be like our Men in Black and someone else's Men in Black. But I investigated a lot of reports of people and interviewed a lot of eyewitnesses, people who've had UFO experiences. In some cases, never told anybody about the encounters. And then late one night, they'll get this sort of slow banging on the front door and they open it. And there's this sort of ominous-looking character who looks like they've stepped out of some like late 1940s gumshoe detective film, with the trench coat and the fedora hat and the sunglasses and, they look like Al Capone or somebody like that. And so, they're kind of daunting, disturbing experiences of the people, and these entities warn people not to talk about UFO experiences, and then they sort of vanish as mysteriously as they arrived, and no government agency will own up to, having dispatched them or whatever. And it's been an ongoing aspect of the UFO mystery pretty much for as long as UFOs have been seen.
Well, I have a little story of my own, and I've only told it once on this show. About a year and a half ago, when I was I started really getting out there with a lot of this information, and I got a knock on my door. I was living alone, and to my surprise, I opened the door, and I thought these guys were like church guys or something like that. I mean, they were dressed in dark suits. They had like kind of a darkish pinstripe to them. They had that old look to them, like you just mentioned, and sunglasses, and they had like some kind of briefcase in their arms that they were holding. And I said, "Can I help you?" And they just, the entire time I opened the door, the entire time we made contact, they just had these big crap-eating grins on their faces. And one says, "We don't really like the things you're talking about." And I said, "Excuse me?" I said, "Did you just threaten me?" And he says, "No, sir, we're just trying to sell Bibles." And I got spooked out, and I shut the door, and I looked out of the window, and I didn't see them anywhere, and I went around the entire place looking. And so I seen one of your YouTube videos where you were talking about this, and I was amazed by it. I thought, maybe somebody was just playing a joke, but I mean, I looked out of the window immediately, and I didn't see anybody. Was it the Men in Black? I don't know, but...
that's one of the classic aspects, the weird aspects we get in some of these stories where, people talk to them, they shut the door, and then they're like, why did I even talk to that person? And they open the front door, and they don't even see him going down the drive. They don't see a car in the street. It's like they've just vanished.
Yeah, I didn't hear a car, I didn't see a car, and I didn't see them leave. And I was pretty spooked out by it. First off, I'm home. You know, you think you're big and bad until you open the door and you see two strange people, and they looked kind of palish. And as you said, a lot of their face was hidden with glasses and hat, and so.
Well, the weird thing is, as well, of course, you know, when you're dealing with these sorts of accounts, like you pointed out, they don't outright threaten. Often, what they do is they kind of leave you with the impression that it's a threat, but they never outwardly make it. It's kind of like they create like an unsettling feeling where you feel you're being intimidated or threatened, but it always almost like gives them an out where they say, "Oh no, you know, we're just interested and we prefer you not to talk about it," and they let you kind of join the dots together of what might happen rather than them outwardly coming and saying so.
Right. I mean, that was the nicest way anybody ever told me to shut up.
Yeah. Well, that's what they're good at doing.
Yeah. Now, let's talk about NASA just a little bit. Now, what kind of things do you think they're lying about? I mean, I've heard of bases on the moon. Then, of course, there's the big face on Mars. You know, what do they know that they're not telling us? I know you've done some research in that area.
Yeah, and I think it's like a lot of agencies. I think for the most part, 99.9% of all the people who work for these agencies, whether it's NASA, the CIA, or whoever, you know, they're not in the picture any more than any of the rest of us are. You know, it's not like you join the CIA or NASA and you're suddenly told what happened at Roswell. You know, it's relevant. It's relative to whether it's part of your job. You know, to know these things. That's how secrets are kept. So I'm pretty sure that the vast majority of people who work at NASA are just everyday regular people working on scientific studies. But like many of these agencies, there seems to be a small body or group within the organization that knows far more about what's going on with respect to UFOs. And I think one of the areas about which a great deal is known that we haven't been told is with respect to the face on Mars, this huge carved structure in an area of Mars called Cydonia, where what looks like a very ancient carved face, not unlike the Egyptian Sphinx, stares upwards from the planet's surface. And I think, there's very little doubt in my mind that the face on Mars is an artificial carved structure, probably carved, possibly even tens and tens of thousands of years ago by what may well have been an indigenous Martian race that suffered some sort of catastrophic disaster in its ancient past. But I think there's far more known about the face on Mars at an official level, and there's like a deep desire not to share that data with us, possibly because it could have some sort of impact on our ancient past. The face on Mars doesn't just stand alone. If you look at some of these surrounding photographs, they show what look like pyramid-type structures. And, of course, when you kind of invoke things that look like the Sphinx and they're associated with pyramid-type formations, inevitably that draws parallels with the Egyptian Sphinx and the Egyptian pyramids. So people wonder, if there was a big catastrophe on Mars, did the people who made the face possibly come to the Earth? Could they have influenced some of our early civilizations? Could they have been responsible for some of our religious and God legends? If that was proven, it could sort of shake up religion, and I think that's one of the reasons why the truth about the face on Mars is hidden, because it could potentially open this sort of Pandora's box of controversies. It could change the way we look at our own history and our lives, if you like.
Absolutely. And another theory out there, and maybe it's one of mine, is that perhaps in the far past that there was human beings here on Earth who were that much advanced that they were actually using Mars. Maybe it was somewhat livable at one time, and maybe that could very well be a mark of our past.
Yeah, and that's an interesting theory that a number of researchers have suggested, that maybe it wasn't made by indigenous Martians. Maybe, long before our civilization, there was another civilization, hundreds of thousands of years ago, who knows when, that destroyed itself like we're possibly in danger of doing today. And that they achieved spaceflight, went to Mars, destroyed themselves, and all we have left today are sort of ancient memories and myths of these fantastic beings coming down and, the gods with incredible powers. Maybe they were actually distorted legends of an advanced race that came before our race. And maybe they were the ones who built it. Maybe they were never indigenous Martians. Maybe it was just us going there in the distant past And, today's civilization on Earth, we think we're the first and the best. Maybe we're not. Maybe we're just the latest in a long line of civilizations that have risen and fallen before us.
Right. I mean, it wasn't too long ago people thought the world was flat. So.
Yeah, now look where we are. Yeah, you get burned at the stake for saying the world was round 500 years ago.
Oh, sure. And, a lot of these drawings that are in caves and these artifacts that they find, I mean, I don't know. For me, supposedly they didn't have TV back then. They didn't have these kind of technology. So I would think they would have had to have seen this stuff to be able to recreate it. Or they had one hell of an imagination.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's one of the things they actually did. You're quite right. They didn't have TV. Their form of communication and telling stories was to draw the stories. In the same way that we record stuff, whether in email today and books and things, that was their way of doing it. And so, you record things today that you see or that experience. They were no different. So, I think we shouldn't write off cave paintings and drawings of weird, anomalous things as just a bit of entertainment. That was their way of passing on stories and accounts and things like that.
Yeah, and I do believe that there's, a lot of these answers would probably exist. They probably do exist, but we're just not getting them. I've said that before, too, about the whole Noah's Ark thing. I said, well, could it be that it was Noah's ship? And, this was all DNA that was put on? And, so who knows?
Well, yeah, I mean, this is an interesting area. I've actually debated this with a number of people who sort of take the story of Noah's Ark literally. And if you look at it logically, it's nonsense to take it literally. There's no way Noah and a couple of other people could have rounded up 2 of every animal on the entire planet. It's like I'd like to see him, round up a fully grown Bengal tiger or 2 Bengal tigers and say, "Come on this way on board the ship." Noah would be torn apart. How would you get 2 fully grown polar bears?
Well,
never mind traveling all around the world. So my view is that maybe the story could be based on not just collecting animals, or not even collecting animals, but as you say, collecting DNA and storing it where the animals in a potential catastrophe could be reproduced. The idea it's almost like a seed vault. You do have certain places around the world where they have so-called seed vaults where, in the event of a disaster, important plants and crops can be regrown from seed. It would make more sense to use the essence or the DNA or, the gene splicing techniques to recreate certain animals rather than the simplistic approach of leading every single planet and an animal on the planet 2 by 2 onto a boat, which would sink under the weight of, if they had to carry 2 of every animal on the planet. It's impossible.
Well, I had one person one time did argue with me about that and said absolutely not. It was a big enough ship, and they could have fit them on there. And, I don't know. I wasn't around back then, but I tend to think it would be more likely that there was DNA. And, of course, when you say the tigers would rip them apart, they'll say, well, God guided them, which possibly could be, but I don't think so.
Well, the problem is, I don't care what people believe. It's not my position to say they're wrong or right. But what I would say is that people who take that approach, they just take a simplistic approach and say, oh, it's just God's magic. I'm not denigrating their belief systems, but that's what they say.
Mm-hmm.
Well, you can't have that approach, every time. It's kind of like, somebody lives to be 95 and they go to church. They say, well, that proves, they were a godly person. They lived to 95. Somebody else goes to church, gets killed in a car crash at 20, and they say, well, God moves in mysterious ways.
Yeah.
You can't have it both ways, and it's the same with things like Noah's Ark. It's too simplistic, and, you need to look at it from a physical, literal perspective, from a perspective of a rational perspective, not from the idea that these stories are literal truth come hell or high water.
That's right, and I've made this point before too, that if we went back, say, I don't know, 400, 300, 500 years, and we flew a helicopter over any civilization, they would have for sure probably thought we were gods.
Oh yeah, and that's what a lot of it comes down to is interpretation. I don't mean to point out that stories of floods and things like that are nonsense and legends. I don't think they are, but the interpretation of what they mean. We have to remember in the 21st century, we're still believing the interpretations put on these phenomena by people 2,500 years ago. Religion is the only aspect of our lives where we apply 2,500-year-old belief systems. We don't do operations and surgeries on people's hearts based upon 200-year-old surgical techniques. So why do we hold belief systems that are, have 2,000 origins thousands of years ago? Religion is the only area of our lives in which people do that.
Oh, right. And, I don't doubt for a minute that there's some kind of God. I really don't.
Mm-hmm.
And I said that too, that how do we know that people didn't misinterpret the message? Yeah. It's possible.
Yeah, I mean, when you talk about sort of gods, etc., again, people put a simplistic approach that, well, no, my God's real, yours isn't, etc.
Yeah, that my daddy can beat up your daddy thing.
Exactly. Now, it's clear because there's so many different religions around the world, they can't all be right. Some believe in heaven and hell, some believe in one realm of the afterlife, others believe in reincarnation, some believe that animals have souls, others don't believe they have souls. I think what this points out is that, and I actually do believe this, that there is a good chance that some sort of essence or soul, however you want to define it, survives bodily death. But I think the simplistic notion of a heaven and hell is just too simplistic. That's almost like a parable to keep people in line control them through fear and guilt. You'll go to this place or this place if you're good or bad. It may well be that the afterlife is some sort of dimensional realm that actually can be explained in the form of extra dimensions, and that the soul exists or resides in one of these extra dimensions, whatever it might be. But the ancients interpreted extra dimensions as realms, like a fiery pit where there's this guy with horns and a pitchfork, which, to me, comes across more along the lines of, if it's saying to the kids, if you don't go to bed at night, the monster in the closet will come and get you or whatever. So.
Right. Okay, well, we need to take another break back. And, I agree with you with the ghost thing. I think that paranormal, it is, in my opinion, I think it is two dimensions crossing. I think that when we die, I think we do go to another dimension.
Yeah, I think, that's an interesting theory. To me, it's a more viable and believable theory than the sort of simplistic notion that if you do so much good, you go to a place where everything's cool and you sit around all day and there's pearly gates, and if you're bad, you're pushed in this fiery pit by this guy with horns. To me, that's no different to stories like Santa Claus and the Tooth Fairy.
Exactly.
But it doesn't mean that the ancients didn't recognize that something happened at death, and also recognize that there were other realms of existence that maybe we're only able to interact with in some sort of afterlife scenario, but maybe they didn't understand it. And unfortunately, I think what often happens with not mainstream religion, but what happens with any religion is it gets hijacked by people who want to use it as a tool of control. Mm-hmm. And they use it as a tool of control via fear, manipulation, and guilt. And it actually works on whole swathes of the population, and that's a dangerous thing when you start manipulating widely held belief systems as a means to exert control on the population. But it does happen.
Yeah, I've always said I think religion's a great thing. I think having a belief system is wonderful. But I think organized religion, I think they've taken it a step too far, and I think that a lot of times it is used for control, and I think that we're misled. And not to say that other dimension we go to is not heaven. Call it what you will. Whatever it is, at least I think there's enough proof to say that we go on, that when we die, that's not it. Mm-hmm. I myself have had an out-of-body experience, so that right there tells me there's something more than that body.
Yeah, I think everybody, if they haven't had a personal experience, they know someone who's had a weird experience at the point somebody's died, they've had a dream the person visited them, or, something strange happened. Lots of people get that sort of experience. And I think, when you look at the sheer scale of it, it is indicative that something goes on. But, clearly all the world's religions can't be right because they have wildly differing views in some cases, and yet everybody insists, no, their version's right and everybody else's is wrong.
Absolutely, and I say this too. I don't care if somebody worships a rock. As long as you're not hurting other people, that's up to you, I guess. But for me, I do believe that I don't know what to call it. I mean, yes, the Bible and certain religions will call it heaven or call it what have you. I just know that there is something after. I think a lot of these ghost shows that you see, I don't believe all that stuff all the time, but I do believe there is a way to connect with the other side. And, I guess till it happens to an individual, they're just going to always have that doubt.
Yeah, you're right. And I think, the big problem is, of course, the only way to find out is when we all sort of shuffle off. But the problem is, for the most part, history, if you like, has shown that if life after death is real, but it's incredibly, although people have experiences afterwards, where they see dead relatives, it seems incredibly difficult for the dead to get a message across. It's always it's difficult, it's fragmentary. So in other words, it's like the only way you can prove it is when you go there, but then the irony is it's difficult to actually tell anybody you've left behind.
Yeah,
but it's real.
Really, you can't, because even if somebody came to me right now from the other side and says, "Hey, it's real," there's something here, and I told everybody about it, they're going to still go, "I don't know about that." So, it's an individual experience. I think.
No, you're right, and I think my view has always been with something like this that I kind of look at this a little bit differently to where I do with things like Bigfoot, where I point out to people, that this is an area really where belief itself plays a role, but it shouldn't be the overriding issue. The overriding issue should be look for evidence of what's going on with an open mind, and don't be caught up by saying, I'm Christian or I'm that or whatever, I'm Buddhist, because they may all have their role to play in it, but they clearly they can't all have the right facts, if you like, all the facts, when they have different views and ideas. So I think it's very important that we should investigate issues relative to life after death from a scientific, open perspective. Don't go in trying to vindicate this religious belief system or that one. Realize that those scenarios, those belief systems have been built up to try and explain what is probably a genuine phenomenon that ancient man didn't fully understand, but we still adhere to ancient man's ways of understanding and interpreting it, even though they were created thousands of years ago.
Yeah, and that's another area where there's always excuses. If somebody says, "Hey, my aunt was talking to angels or talking to somebody before she passed away," and they'll say, "Well, that's just the mind. It's its protective mechanism to keep you from, fearing dying," or they say it's the medication. And I mean, it just, unless the ghost comes out and smacks somebody, they just don't want to believe it.
No, you're right, and I think a lot of people point out with out-of-body experiences. That's evidence of something surviving. I actually think that is the case, but the important thing is, a lot of people assume that when people have out-of-body experiences, or near-death experiences, I should say, not out-of-body experiences. Mm-hmm. When people have near-death experiences, on the hospitals, etc., and they report sort of a tunnel of light and seeing a deity or whatever, they don't always see the Christian God. Some see a deity relative to their own religious beliefs. Some see nothing at all. So, in other words, I think it's possible that, in some respects, maybe the realm of the afterlife is partly, what we experience is partly dictated by what we believe. It could be almost like a permanently evolving hologram. In other words, so if you believe, you're going to go somewhere full of angels, etc., maybe you really see it. Maybe the afterlife for each of us is kind of like a dream life. Like a dreamlike world where this particular dimension reflects and interacts with our imaginations, our souls, if you like, our collective memories throughout our lives. And maybe we all live in separate afterlives, that we don't realize we're constantly generating them as time is going on. We think, it's almost like a waking dream. Perhaps, and we're constantly, the afterlife is like a never-ending dream, and everybody's is different. We don't realize it,
Yeah, I've had psychics tell me you're an old soul. And, sometimes I wonder, am I on that plane where we're all old souls. We've all died before, and this is where we went now, and now it's time to move on to the next stage. There's just so many questions, and and somebody said it well not too long ago. I was on this show. The more answers you get, the more questions you get. And it just
Yeah, I think it's like a lot of these mysteries that they provoke so much controversy. They're so belief-driven that it's difficult to impact upon widely held, sort of cherished beliefs that have been nurtured over such a long period. That because it's almost like people become defensive. I don't attack people for holding whatever belief they want to believe. I just think it's important we look at all angles, but that's often perceived as that you're attacking their belief systems, which is actually a very different thing, really.
That's right. Now, there's something else I wanted to touch on with you before we cut it tonight. It was said that a satellite existed in space that was discovered when we actually sent one of our first satellite out into space. Now, of course, that's not out in newspapers or anything, but this is a story that I hear a lot of. Is there any truth to that? Do you know of?
Do you mean a terrestrial satellite, you mean?
Yeah.
Or somebody else's?
Well, apparently there was a satellite. The story goes there was a satellite, like a black box kind of satellite that was orbiting the planet. And that would prove that there was a satellite put out there before we had that technology to do it.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's actually sort of two strands to that story. One being that, that there is a story about in the 1950s, supposedly the U.S. military was tracking some sort of orbital object, vast thing in the skies, which nobody knew what it was. This was pre-Sputnik era, but nobody knew what this thing was. And there's a variant on the theory that maybe there's been some sort of like a clandestine space program going on long before the acknowledged programs like Apollo and Mercury and Gemini and even Sputnik. Of course, it's a controversial area, but, I mean, a number of UFO researchers do firmly believe, there could be, more so today than in the past even, a secret space program that we know nothing about. So, in other words, when astronauts see strange things in space, and even occasionally perceive them as being UFOs, it may be that even they're unaware that, somebody else is running a classified program alongside theirs even.
Yeah, I've seen videos, NASA videos, where they've, out in space, where you actually can see these objects moving around, I think it was the space shuttle or the space station, but these things were actually, they're little objects and they're moving all over the place out there, moving just like a UFO would. And then I seen one video where a laser came from the Earth and tried to shoot one of them down. And, I mean, it was a real video. I mean, it wasn't fixed or any of that. I mean, it was even in the news. So that's just amazing stuff.
Oh, yeah, there's a lot of that footage. I mean, one of the ironies is, you can find it on places like YouTube. But NASA, in some cases at least, hasn't hidden this evidence. They just said, we think it's ice crystals, etc. And, of course, the big problem is it's not like somebody says they saw a UFO and it's landed in the woods of the Pacific Northwest where we can go to. 99.99% of us cannot go into space and check this sort of stuff out for ourselves. We're left to... all we can really do is analyze the footage. That's why the whole issue of the face on Mars is so difficult to resolve, because most of us, right now, we can't go to Mars. We can't step on it and look at it and tap on it with a hammer or whatever and see what it really is. So.
I remember when I first heard about that face on Mars, I think it was in the early 90s or the mid-90s, and it came out, and I heard it on Coast to Coast, and Richard C. Hoagland was talking about it, and I thought, wow, that's amazing. And then they come out and try to say, oh, it's just shadows, the way the lighting was hitting, and there's, that's a face.
Yeah, and, I think, NASA's position, they don't avoid talking about it, but that's exactly what they say, that when the light and the shadows fall on the rock in certain directions, that it looks like a face. They equate it to people seeing faces in clouds, that sort of thing. Now, but if you look at the full analysis that's been done by various highly qualified people, And you see the surrounding structures as well that do look, as I said, very pyramid-like. They don't look like weathered rocks, as NASA has suggested. Then I think we are seeing evidence of something, who built it, what its meaning is, what its connection is with us. They're the arguably bigger issues than the existence of the face itself. But, I think that's the problem. The face itself has the ability to open so many doors to other controversies even bigger than that one. So.
And unfortunately, much like our mainstream media, our space program has been pretty much controlled as well. I mean, they're not going to let information get out that they don't want to get out. And while it may not be NASA's fault, but at the same time, I wish somebody would leak it out. Just finally get out the actual absolute proof. I mean...
Well, I think I'm not convinced that the government, as a lot of people are, is going to one day take us under its wing, so to speak, and say, hey, we've lied or whatever, we've hidden certain cases, but now we're going to reveal it all to you. I think if they were going to do that, they probably would have done it, and I think that there's no benefit to doing so from their perspective. I think if the truth comes out, it'll either be the entities behind the UFO phenomenon will take control and they'll land. And there's no way, with the mighty power of every government on the planet, if they collectively got together, they could not stop that story from getting out. If UFOs are hovering over every city or whatever.
I bet they'd try, though.
Well, they might try, but if that doesn't happen, I think there's only two other ways really it could happen. One would be that if a whistleblower leaked something so undeniable that it brought down the whole house of cards, or I think possibly even more likely, maybe something got declassified by mistake. You have these government archivists whose job it is just to classify mountains of material and go through the old files to see what can be released to the public and what can't be. If something like a classified document leaked through by mistake, just a bureaucratic error, and it talked, in a document on military experimentation in New Mexico in the 40s, and it happened to make a mention of Roswell that somebody had overlooked, just one paragraph, that could actually open so many doors as well. So I think it could be something more alternative along those lines that could get the truth out.
Unfortunately, about 98% of the people are asleep behind the wheel, so if the government accidentally leaks something out like that, if they said it was a hoax, 98% of the people would probably believe them.
Well, they probably would. They'd just go back to watching reality TV.
Oh, yeah, exactly. The biggest loser. Had no idea it was them sitting on that couch. So, okay, why don't we get out your website again and tell everybody once more where they can get your books, and you got a few minutes to get out anything that you want.
Okay. Well, people can find out more about my books, etc., at nickredfernsbooks.blogspot.com. I also have a cryptozoology blog on strange creatures, which is monsterusa.blogspot.com. The books are available from Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Borders, and I've got a new book coming out in June, which I'll make sure the publishers send you, Michael. It's called The Real Men in Black, and it's a study of... I wrote a book a few years ago called On the Trail of the Saucer Spies, which is a study of the government Men in Black. This one is a study of the stranger, weirder-looking Men in Black, and that'll be out in June.
Well, I appreciate that. That's a book I'll be very interested in because of my own experience, especially. But I really think it could be a partnership. Maybe the Men in Black, it might be alien and human, because I've heard some strange things. I remember Art Bell talking about the Men in Black once, that he's seen them. So amazing stuff, really is.
Oh, yeah, I think, it's a mistake to suggest the Men in Black are just one thing. And in the book, I actually address 5 or 6 different theories for who they might be or what they might be. And it might be that one theory doesn't necessarily rule out another. They could be, a wide range of Men in Black, all with different agendas, but we kind of lump them under one category, if you like.
Right, and then, these things come out, before you know it, they make a movie out of it, they make it a funny, kind of hysterical thing, and before you know it, people just say, oh, that's just movie stuff. And,
Exactly, that's what happens. People don't realize that the truth behind the fiction, sometimes the truth comes before the fiction, not the other way around.
Sure, look at Star Trek. They were using these little devices calling each other,
Yeah, exactly.
Kind of like one of those beep-beep things, And now look, it's reality.
Yeah, you're right.
Okay, Nick. Well, thank you so much for being a guest on Late Night in the Midlands. This has been a very interesting 2 hours. I appreciate it.
Mike. I appreciate having me on the show, and I think we covered a lot of areas. So.
We sure did. So thank you so much, and please continue the great work that you do, and I'd love to get you back in the future.
All right.
In the Midlands, Nick.
Hey, Michael. Thanks for having me on the show.
Oh, thank you so much for taking the time out to be with us.
Oh, sure. I'm happy to.
All right, great. If you would, let's start out. Maybe you could tell us a little more about your background, what got you started in all this, and maybe give us some reference in some of your books and where to get them.
All right, sure. Well, my intro, I'm one of these people who's into UFOs, who's never actually had a personal UFO experience. You know, a lot of people do get into the subject because they've seen something weird and they want to find out what it is. Mm-hmm. But in my case, my interest goes back to when I was a young teenager. My dad was in the British Royal Air Force and worked on radar, and he was involved in a number of incidents in the early 1950s where the radar guys tracked UFOs flying over the North Sea off the east coast of England. Mm-hmm. And the first thought was, well, it's got to be the Russians, launching a sneak attack. This was the height of the Cold War. And so aircraft were sent up, fighter planes from a nearby Air Force base to try and intercept what they thought were Russian bombers or something along those lines.
Sure.
And when they got up there, they actually reported seeing these weird balls of light in the sky that were performing fantastic maneuvers and speeds and hovering and zipping around behind the aircraft, to the point where eventually they all had to return to base, and because they were running low on fuel. This went on for several nights, and in the end, everybody was taken into a room. That's the pilots, the radar people, ground crew, etc., and told, you won't talk about this. And my dad didn't talk about it till I was, like I said, about 13, and he told me then. And that sort of really got me interested in the subject in terms of reading about it, and not so much doing research at that age, but, buying books and subscribing to magazines and things. Mm-hmm. And then when I finished school, I began working on a rock music magazine back in England for a couple of years called Zero. And I still do mainstream journalism stuff now, but that was sort of what got me involved in journalism. And then I thought, after a few years of doing that, why not try and combine the background in journalism with the interest in weird stuff, whether
Right.
it's UFOs or Bigfoot or whatever, and combine the two. So that's what I did, and I've written for, as you pointed out in the introduction, for various magazines. I write quite regularly for UFO Magazine and Fate and 14 Times, and done about 20 books myself, and, as you said, also ghost writing for other authors on anything really, sort of pretty much related to weird stuff, I guess.
Yeah, that's it's a big interest nowadays. I mean, before people were interested years ago, but they're afraid to speak up about what they've seen. And now it's like people everywhere are coming out with this information. And, something I wanted to touch on is this FBI memo that came out about Roswell. Have you had a chance to see that?
Yeah, I have. I mean, it's interesting because, Roswell's one of these cases where it just never goes away. The interesting thing about Roswell, we know that there was sort of a heavy military involvement in whatever happened, but that's sort of confounded by the fact that we only have one or two pieces of official paperwork on the case, one being this FBI document which references the recovery of the object and then its transfer for analysis to another location. And after that, everything goes quiet. The government says, well, we've searched and we can't find any other paperwork. It's like it's just all vanished. But at least because there are one or two things that have surfaced, it's encouraging that maybe one day we might get other files possibly as well.
Yeah, as these files and more evidence keeps piling up, and I mean, you got millions of accounts of UFO sightings. I mean, I've said this a million times, I'll say it again, in a court of law, if, 100,000 people pointed me out as committing a crime, I'd be done. So, but yet hundreds of thousands of people see UFOs, and it's just swept under the rug all the time.
Well, that's right, and I think the big problem is that the reason the secrecy's been kept so well is I think the number of people actually in the know is probably very small. And I think because of that, the trying to find out who it is that's hiding the truth, that's what makes it difficult, because they're not in the wide open. They're buried very deeply, to the point where not only do we not know what to look for really, but we don't even know exactly where to go looking for it. Which agencies sitting on the big secrets, which ones are sitting on interesting data, but they don't have the hard evidence. A lot of people don't realize that the various government agencies don't necessarily just hide information from the public, but they actually don't always share information with each other, which makes it even harder to to dig out the truth.
Sure, but they've done a good job of hiding the evidence, I would say, but I don't think they've done a good job of keeping the secret, because I think more people than not believe that we have been visited, and I happen to be one of them people, and I know you are too.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think, what the government has done is managed to hide the hard evidence, sort of, the nuts and bolts evidence, but they obviously haven't been able to hide the fact that people see UFOs, because, there's just no way to do that. If half a dozen people driving home one night see a UFO in the sky or say they've been abducted, well, government agencies, it's physically impossible to hide that sort of stuff. So I think people realize there's a genuine phenomenon. What the government, unfortunately, has been successful at doing is preventing us getting past just the testimony and to the hard data that would prove it.
See, now I get asked this question a lot. Do you think that we're close to disclosure? And I always say that disclosure's already happened. I think enough people have come out and spoke about these things. I think the bigger question is will the government ever admit to it?
Yeah, that's right. I think the big problem is in whose mind have we solved it? I think if you look at the collective body of information we have, you can argue we have disclosure, because in a court of law, people have been convicted of murder when there's no body. Mm-hmm. So in other words, if you can convict someone of murder without actually finding the body, then you should be able to prove the existence of UFOs by the collective body of material of evidence that's been put together and analysed from credible sources. So in that sense, we do have disclosure, but I think unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on which way you look at it, people still want, at the end of the day, demonstrable proof that these things exist. That's what I want as well. I believe there's a genuine phenomenon, there's no doubt in my mind about that. But I'd still like to see the body in frozen storage or whatever at some military base, just to be able to say with certainty that yes, this all exists.
Oh, exactly. Me too. Now, I don't know about you, but I've had UFO sightings, and I can't say who was driving them or if anybody was up there driving them. I know that what I seen was nothing I've ever seen in an airport before. So, I think for me, it's pretty much proven in my mind. But yeah, I would like to see a body too. Even more so, I'd like to see one alive.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I think we'd all like that. But, sort of joking aside, I think the only way we really will, we just have to keep pushing and pushing for more information and just, really trying to get the hard evidence, etc., of what's going on and, what this all means and what the implications are for us. And when we get to that point, we can then go to the next step. Right now, we're at the point where, we know there's a tremendous body of material evidence, etc. It's how we get past that to, the next level then, I think.
Right. And, I was talking about contactees in the beginning of the show, saying that, that was something we would touch on. And,
yeah.
There have been many contactees who have actually been put to lie detector tests and have passed. I mean, take Travis Walton's case, for instance. All them guys took lie detector tests and they passed.
Oh, yeah, there's